What do you get when you take The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild, slap a Sonic the Hedgehog skin on top, and then also duct tape a regular Sonic game back onto it? You get Sonic Frontiers, and it makes for one of the most fun games I've played in a long time. Yes, the game has been out for 2 years, and I'm still going to make the Breath of the Wild comparisons literally everyone else has made. I don't think it's possible to talk about Sonic Frontiers without making at least one, and also, I'm unoriginal. After 10 years of 3D Sonic games being mid at best, and forces at worst, it's nice to see an actually good 3D Sonic game. Although unfortunately, despite everything the game does right, it falls that little bit short in so many areas, making it the Sonic game that was almost perfect. Every stage in Sonic Frontiers is your standard Sonic affair that we've seen time and time again since 1991. Well, except for the 3D ones, they've only been around since 1998. And sure, they are well designed and are lots of fun, but there's nothing new here. It's the exact same gameplay we've had since Colors. Because of this, I'm not going to talk about them for very long. They're here, they're polished, and unlike other Sonic games, I've never clipped through the floor or had game mechanics decide to stop working for no reason. So if you only take into consideration the quality of the stages, this game is one of the best Sonic games there is. But we aren't here for the regular Sonic stages. Obviously, the main attraction in Sonic Frontiers is that for the first time ever, Sonic is playable in an open world. Well, technically Sonic Adventure's hub world does kind of count, but this is the first time that it's actually been fun and not a nuisance that has just made finding the next level harder. So, how well does Sonic fare in his first open world outing? Well, Sonic Frontiers open world is somehow both full of things to do and completely empty at the same time. Okay, I should probably elaborate on what I mean by that. The Starfall Islands are chock full of enemies, puzzles, platforming challenges, and mini-bosses scattered all throughout the map. This is all super cool to see and is such a good time just running around, exploring, fighting enemies, and solving puzzles. I love that they took the standard Sonic gameplay and expanded on it. Like, this game has an actual combat system that ties into Sonic's regular moves. It's not complicated in the slightest. Honestly, I could probably get through most of the game by hitting my controller with a hammer repeatedly. But this isn't supposed to be Dark Souls. It's Sonic the Hedgehog. It's a game all about speed, and the combat perfectly complements that. It's all about running around and quickly striking your enemies whenever there's an opening. The platforming challenges scattered around make traversing the map to get to the next point one of the best parts of the game. Why run from point A to point B when there are grind rails and bounce pads I can use instead, and everything feels so nice and fluid? And while exploring, you'll come across various puzzles and challenges to complete to get rewards or reveal more of the map. You can't take 5 steps without coming across something to do. But even with all that, the game still does feel empty. Despite having so much to do, there doesn't feel like there's a point to it. All this great stuff is hindered by the way that it's presented. When you complete puzzles, a seed of power will randomly appear on the ground, which you can trade to increase your stats. But you don't feel like you accomplished anything because all that happens is a number in the corner of the screen goes up. It also doesn't help that all of the puzzles are incredibly easy and shallow. They were cool at first when you actually had to take some time to figure out what to do, but by the time you've made it to the final island, you've seen every type of puzzle 100 times, and there isn't any more depth to them than there was back on the first island. The same applies to collecting Cocos. You just find them lying around randomly on the ground, and go trade them in for more boosts. There is no challenge or fanfare, and barely a noticeable difference in actual gameplay. Hell, at the time of writing this, I'm still not sure what increasing your defense actually does, and it takes away any sense of pride or achievement. If we compare that to Breath of the Wild, it makes a whole show about completing a shrine, each of which are actually challenging, collecting another Spirit Orb, and increasing your abilities to build up that sense that you actually did something. You see how Sonic Frontiers just completely misses the mark. Or, how about the fact that to progress the story, for the most part all you do is collect memory tokens, and you collect memory tokens by randomly running around and picking them up. Sometimes you have to do some platforming, and sometimes you just find a pile of them on the ground. I get that this is probably done so you explore the map, but all it does is create a tedious grind where you have to spend 20 minutes tracking down memory tokens to progress. You should give me a reason to want to explore, not a reason to force me to explore. And it sucks because it is actually really fun just aimlessly running around, but it suddenly becomes a lot less fun when there is a gun pointing out the back of my head. It wouldn't even be that difficult to structure the game to make progression more engaging. Rather than having a bunch of easy puzzles to increase your stats, have fewer but more difficult and in-depth puzzles akin to Breath of the Wild shrines. Or have the story be progressed by defeating the mini-bosses that you can find around the map, so rather than collecting 100 memory tokens scattered on the ground, have the player defeat one of the mini-bosses and use something dropped by that instead. I spent all of 5 minutes on those ideas, so they probably aren't great, but the point is, you need to give things a sense of purpose and depth. I think in this case, less is more. I would rather each island had 10 good puzzles rather than 100 mediocre ones. And you can take that sentiment and apply it to most of what's in this game. Okay, quick side note, something I didn't realize until like the last island of the game is that you can actually get every single collectible from Big the Cat by doing his fishing minigame. And now we have the opposite problem because you can max out your stats in like 5 minutes this way. Actually, I'm pretty sure you can beat the entire game with max stats without ever completing a single stage or challenge, except for like the scripted events, just by buying vault keys and memory tokens. I don't know why you would do this, but the option is there. So in short, the open world has incredibly fun gameplay with god-awful presentation. It's like if you serve a perfectly cooked steak on a Minions plastic kiddie plate. It's still going to taste really good, but that minion will be staring into your soul the entire meal. Just to end things on a high note, by far the best aspect of the gameplay is the boss fights. Even though they mostly consist of mashing one button, are just so incredibly hype. The boss fights are basically just supersonic power trips, and I am perfectly okay with that. Supersonic is supposed to be an incredibly overpowered being, so just having him wail on these giant monster things while some insane music plays is fine by me. This game has probably the best boss fights in any Sonic game. Typically I find Sonic boss fights kinda boring because they feel really slow compared to the rest of the game, but these ones just all go so hard. And amazingly, I don't have any problems with the boss fights. Well, aside from some performance issues in the Wyvern fight, as whenever the animation for a successful counter would play, a black screen would appear for a few seconds while it loaded. So congratulations Sega, you managed to do something right. Sonic Frontier's story admittedly does fall a little flat. They lean in a bit heavily towards the whole being cryptic and mysterious, but end up leaning over the edge just that little bit too far and fall into the pit of not revealing enough to make an engaging story. I mean, you make it halfway through the game and all you know is that for some reason everyone is stuck in cyberspace and that these little robot things are probably dead guys that for some reason look like chaos. Admittedly, many other Sonic games also fall into this trap, and you aren't playing any of them expecting it to compete with The Last of Us or some shit like that, but it's still pretty frustrating when you have Sonic say, "These ruins are like the ones on Angel Island. I wonder what that could mean," and have Knuckles respond with, "Nah, those are nothing alike. But these identical ruins over here are totally like the Angel Island ones, what a discovery." And that's all you get in 3 hours of gameplay. Sure, you do get a few hints dropped throughout, but it just keeps implying the same stuff over and over again. The third time you see Sonic absorb the cyber energy and be hurt by it doesn't reveal anything new. Sure, it does drive home what you already said the first 2 times, but I'd already figured that out for myself. It does feel a little bit like the game thinks you're an idiot with the memory of a goldfish. And it really sucks because I loved the direction the game was heading in. For the first time, Sega has managed to make a Sonic game with a darker, more mature tone without going into cringe edgelord territory. It's not the end of the world because the story isn't actively bad and what is given is actually pretty good. I just want more and it's disappointing that we didn't get it. Especially because at the start it did feel like the game was setting up that it'd be fairly story driven, but that just never really happened. But to give credit where it's due, the characterization of Sonic and his friends is probably the best it's been in recent years. Sonic himself feels more grown up and serious while still retaining his cockiness and light-hearted nature. But the biggest difference is that it feels like the rest of the cast is starting to get treated more like actual characters rather than smart sidekick, Sonic's love interest, and funny meathead. It's seeming like Sega's trying to get away from some of the issues they've had in the past with a massive cast of barely developed characters, and trying to go forward with a smaller group of more fleshed out characters. Obviously, I can't say anything for sure until future games are released, but I think Frontiers shows us just enough to have hope for the future. I've said before that there is no such thing as a Sonic game with a bad soundtrack. Every single one has been filled with absolute bangers. So the previous games have set a pretty high bar in the music department. Yet Sonic Frontiers, in my opinion, has the best soundtrack out of any Sonic game. The somber, toned-down overworld music heavily contributes to the darker, lonely vibes the game has going on. It feels like what would have happened if Breath of the Wild had decided that it needed more of a soundtrack than some guy falling on a piano every now and again. I have to say, I really love what they have going on here. Some of my favourite tracks in any game fit these vibes, and it's all just so atmospheric. Admittedly, this isn't necessarily the best listening music, but it's damn good game music. The stage music is super fitting of the cyberspace theme, with all the electronic music. I think that's the right genre. I don't fucking know, I'm bad at music. These tracks are more in line with the music from the previous games, but they still feel distinct and are just insanely good. Unlike the overall themes, these are also just really good songs in their own right. And then we have the boss fight music, which as I said earlier is just completely insane. Switching to metal tracks for the climactic moments was one of the best choices that Sega has ever made. Playing the first boss fight was such a hype moment, and Undefeatable being the theme might have just carried it. I think the fact that these tracks are also used so sparingly just makes them hit so much harder. You know that when one of them plays that shit is getting real. So yeah, Frontiers has by far the best soundtrack out of any Sonic game. And don't take that as a knock against any of the others, because again, they're all really good. This just says more about how insane the Frontiers soundtrack goes. Despite the game feeling somewhat unrefined and unpolished, I have to say, I think Sonic Frontiers has the foundations needed to be the best Sonic game. Sega just really needed to do more than scratch the surface of what Sonic Frontiers could have been. Unfortunately, it probably suffered due to Sega being Sega, but if they could have gone more in depth, I really believe that this game could have been up there with some of the other greatest games of all time. But despite that, the game is still incredibly fun, and when you compare it to every other 3D Sonic game Sega has released in the last decade, suddenly all its issues don't look quite so bad. But here's hoping that Sega will see everything that Frontiers did right, bring us a sequel that irons out all the issues, and perhaps we will finally get the perfect Sonic game.